All right. Thank you for everyone for joining us today for our final breakout session of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference 2023. We're so grateful for all the time that you've spent with us over the past 2 days. It's been fantastic engagement, participation. I know I've learned so much and have so many ideas of things to learn about and to implement. And I hope it's been the same for you, that you've been able to learn and make connections and maybe work with other organizations that you've been able to hear about or encounter as a result of this session. But thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to see a few of you at the in-person reception later today as well, from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Lyceum. This session will be collaboration amongst conflict, achieving housing goals when interests vary. Oh, apologies. My name is Alicia Gardner, Senior Policy Analyst with the Partnership for Strong Communities. Chelsea Ross, our Executive Director, is also joining me on this session today. We will be your point people if you have any tech issues, if someone you know is struggling to get on or you're not able to hear, you can find us in the chat and send us a direct message, and we'll give you a hand to make sure you're able to participate in this session. We would like to thank our sponsors that have made this entire conference possible. As you know, it is free of charge to participate and attend, and we know that a lot of people have been able to attend that otherwise might not have been able to, so we're very grateful to our sponsors for their dedication to affordable housing advocacy and education in the state of Connecticut. Our leading sponsor, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. Our visionary sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo. Our champion sponsors, the Bank of America, J.J. Amelia and Associates, M&T Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. And finally, our foundation sponsors, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Cohn Resnick, and Trinity Financial. We'd also like to highlight this session's highlighted investor, the Point32 Health Foundation, for their support with this conference as well. A few housekeeping items. All of our sessions are being recorded. They will be shared on the partnership's YouTube channel within the next week or two. So feel free to revisit this session if you hear anything and learn anything. If there are sessions that you missed or weren't able to catch the whole thing, they will all be on our YouTube channel for you to go back and peruse. Please keep your microphones muted as this is recorded. We do want to make sure the panelists are able to be heard and share their presentation with us today. And again, you can chat with myself or Chelsea Ross if you have any technical issues. Finally, you will receive a notification in the right-hand corner of the Zoom event screen when you end this Zoom event. And it'll just kind of give a notification for you to fill out a survey. We really value your input. We use it to plan for next year's conference. We use it to plan our events during the years. So please take the 30 seconds to fill out our survey and let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want more of, and we will definitely take that into account. And with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Savannah Nicole Vielba, and she will be introducing the panel, her fellow panelists, as well as get more in detail on the topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alicia. All right, bear with me for 1 second as I share my screen. Can everyone see it okay? Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, we want to thank the Partnership for Strong Communities for hosting this wonderful conference and bringing us all here today. Our session, Collaboration Amongst Conflict, Achieving Housing Goals When Interests Vary, is intended to discuss 3 conversations that many advocates, community members, practitioners, legislatures, developers, and implementers are having across the state. As many of us know, the development of housing requires the balancing of many interests that may appear competing, including policy, transportation, the environment, land use, economic, or social interests, just to name a few. Our panelists today bring different perspectives and a shared desire to move towards solutions to address our housing crisis. And I bet this rings true for everybody in the room. By the end of this session, we hope that you'll have a better understanding of another perspective on housing that may vary from the one that you bring to conversations. We need to work together to solve our housing crisis in a meaningful way. And so we're excited to get into the meat and potatoes of our conversation today. So we'll have three main parts of our conversation. We'll start with introductions, which will include a little bit of an interactive audience introduction before the panelists so that everyone can get to know one another. We'll then get into the discussion where we'll touch upon those tensions and commonalities. And then we have time at the end for an open discussion between the panelists and our audience. So I'm going to try, and Alicia, if you can help me. I don't know how to make it prompt our questions. Perfect. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer the question. We're going to move kind of fast, but it's just to give everyone an idea of who's here. So the first question we're going to ask you is IMA, and please identify. We know that people can be many of these things, but we just want you to pick the thing that you most align with for each of these questions. All right, we'll keep going, but we have two people who responded, and I know that there's more of you in the room, but I'm assuming that we do have lots of everyone. So we'll move on to the second question. What perspective do you bring when you're in a housing conversation? Do you bring an environmental perspective, a housing one, land use, transportation, policy, an advocate, justice perspective?
Amanda Nicole, I relaunched the first poll because it looked
Oh.
like it got closed right after two people responded. So I relaunched it so folks can respond, and then I'll move on to your second one.
Okay, perfect.
Double tapping something. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yes, it's moving much more now.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. So we've got both advocates, we have implementers, we have people that we have all sorts of people who work towards this issue, which we're happy to see. All right, Chelsea, if we can move to the next one. We got a good amount of responses, so I'm comfortable keep moving on that one as well. So we have environmental. Ooh, we'll go to the third. What scale do you think is the most effective for housing solutions? And again, this is one where you might think it's multiple, but if you had to pick one, what's coming to mind for you?
Sorry about that. It looks like your second poll question is not even in Zoom for some reason, so I can't launch it.
Oh no, nope, no worries. It just keeps us moving. We appreciate it.
There you go.
Interesting. So we're seeing regional as the highest with 46%, but regional municipal, which is good to see because it's a tension that we'll talk about today. So, all right, I'm comfortable with us closing these. Thank you for engaging with us. We appreciate it. So I'm a little biased, but I think that we have three great panelists in the room with us today. And many of you already know them because of the work they do. So we'll keep introductions short. And so with that, we'll go in this order. So we'll start with Pete, but can you share your name, your organization, and what perspective you bring to housing conversations?
Absolutely. And welcome everybody. And thanks for inviting me to be here. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut, which is the pro-homes coalition of about 80 different neighborhood and nonprofit groups. We're a part of the Regional Plan Association. And our lens is really advocacy on the land use front at the local, state, regional, and federal level.
Awesome. And Rick?
My name's Rick Dunn. I'm the executive director of the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. I'm one of the nine. I lead one of the 9 planning agencies in Connecticut. And we've taken a very sharp focus on reorienting our land use department into a community planning department, and having that team work very closely with municipalities on the various requirements of state law.
Awesome. And Denise?
Hi, Denise Savageau, and I'm recently retired, having spent 35 years as an environmental planner, including 20 in a local municipal land use office, working from conservation, but doing a lot of work with both planning and zoning and inland wetlands. My expertise and what I really focus on is soil and water conservation, but how we then look at that and balance land use and development issues. And one of the things I'm really interested in, and hopefully we'll talk about more in this conversation, is balancing social justice, affordable housing, for example, with environmental justice issues. How do we make sure we're doing both of those at the same time?
Awesome. Well, thank you all. So the first subject that we're going to dive into is one that has been around for many decades under different names. And so we'll call it what we really kind of discuss it as today, sprawl versus transit-oriented development, a decades-long discussion. And so with that, Denise, are there environmental concerns to sprawl?
Well, certainly sprawl is not something from an environmental perspective that we'd like to see. It doesn't recognize ecosystem services that are provided by our forests, fields, farmland. We need to protect those. We need to protect our watersheds. We need to protect our food sheds where we get our food. And we need to protect our air sheds. And one of the things that sprawl does is it just continues to spread out. So, and now that we're talking about climate change, all of the impacts of sprawl are exacerbated. They're made worse. And so we really need to think about what we're doing from that perspective. Sprawl increases impervious cover. And we know that that just wreaks havoc from, in terms of in our watersheds, whether it be water quality, water quantity. So we have flooding, we can have drought, all of these things from impervious covers. I mentioned food sheds and our loss of farmland and the loss of local food systems. That's really critical. Loss of forests. We think about forests a lot of times from a water quality perspective, but certainly from the air quality. And we need to think about that. That's our air sheds. We need to think about how our forests, including our urban forests, function that way. And we also kind of lose the overall biodiversity. And I know people think like, okay, do you need to talk about affordable housing? Where does biodiversity? And I have to say, biodiversity is more than just looking at bugs and bunnies, although it is looking at the bugs a lot, because biodiversity is about the microorganisms in our soil that make sure we have clean water, that help us clean the water. They're the organisms that help us grow our food, like pollinators. So when we're thinking about biodiversity, it's a human health perspective. It's not just the environmental health, although that's critical. And I think we need to continue that. And so we've worked that. Most of us who are in the planning field know and have heard the terms low impact development. So how do we do that? How do we, do some of the things that we've been talking about, transit-oriented development, cluster housing? It's been a tool on our toolbox for many years, but just has not been embraced the way it possibly could. And then, as I said, I wanted to make sure that we're talking about environmental justice, and particularly things like affordable housing. Is it okay to put it in floodplains? Who gets to live at the top of the hill? Because there are issues with putting housing in floodplains, for example. We have issues with mold and mildew. It's not just about the flooding. A lot of times people think, oh, if we elevate the houses, everything is fine. Well, it's not fine. There's still issues with putting people in floodplains, and particularly our most vulnerable communities. You still have to evacuate during disasters, for example. So I think we need to think about it that way. And just another thing from the environmental justice perspective is who has access to open space? Who has access to forests and trees? So when we're talking, so that's where marrying these issues of social justice and environmental justice, we need to be thinking about that. And again, particularly as we're addressing climate change, what are these ecosystem services and how do we make sure that our housing that we're developing is both just and environmental and sustainable?
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, it's a big challenge we're facing, and we're hoping to get into some of that today. And so we'll then talk to Rick about what sort of transportation concerns do you see to sprawl? Are there some that relate to the environmental? Are there just some broad that also need to be considered? Where do you see issues?
Well, I mean, this all goes to the heart of where do we build things and how do we get there? So, it's all well and good that a municipality wants to, let's say, build a subdivision or build an office park out into green space. The developer will build the connections, they'll build the sewer system, they'll build the roadways, they'll create all that impervious surface that Denise was referring to. But when the project is done, normally the bill ends up with the taxpayers. They end up maintaining all of that infrastructure. And to what end? Is it an efficient use of tax resources? A lot of this goes back to Connecticut's fundamental problem. We're reliant on this local property tax system, and we're reliant on 169 towns to fund it individually. So it's really, I know we're not going to talk a lot about the local taxation system, but it then relies upon the state to build transportation systems to get out there. If we're talking about public transportation, we're going to talk about building affordable housing, and we're going to try to get people from homes to jobs. We have to build transportation systems to get there. And the question I think Connecticut needs to ask itself as a transportation ecosystem is, are we of a scale where we need to be doing this, or do we have the types of resources already in place? Our rail lines, our bus lines, our existing infrastructure that we can build around, that are walkable, that don't require motor vehicles, and try and capitalize on those so that we're not spending money foolishly on transportation subsidy. I go around and meet with municipal groups an awful lot, chambers of commerce especially, and I ask them to raise their hand when I get to the type of transportation that they think gets the largest subsidy. And of course, everybody raises their hand. They think buses get the largest subsidy. And then the second largest subsidy they think goes to rail. And nobody believes the largest subsidy goes to automobiles, but that is absolutely the largest subsidy that general taxpayers provide. For us to drive individually in our car, I mean, just think about your commute to work. If you are on a highway, every overpass, every piece of concrete, every light pole, the maintenance of it, the plowing of it, all of that is multiples of what people pay to ride the train. Most train riders, they get the smallest subsidy. They pay about 50% of the cost of their ride on most commuter lines in Connecticut. Bus riders pay about 25% of the cost of their ride. People riding their cars pay about 10% of the cost of their ride. And this, they'll say, oh, I pay gas tax, I pay property taxes. Well, most of those taxes, unless it's a federal gas tax or state gas tax, is not going into that infrastructure. And it's mostly going to operations and maintenance. So I think those are the main concerns about why we want to work against sprawl and encourage smart transportation systems that bring us into more dense areas where we already have infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate you bringing in the financial perspective, because that matters. And it's part of all of ours. There are financial ramifications to not taking care of our environment. There are financial ramifications for not supporting our systems. And so I think that is an undertone that's important to talk about in a policy and an implementation conversation. So with that, Pete, our question for you pivots a little bit based on the work of your organization, but what kind of homes does Connecticut need and where? What are you guys hearing?
Yeah, and really just it builds on what Denise and Rick had previously said of we've got to be smart, first of all, where we build homes and where we don't build homes and jobs. So we have a saying at Desegregate Connecticut, our answer to this question and what do we need to do about the housing and climate crisis is all of the above. With one small caveat, we do not need large single family houses on large minimum lot sizes that we have plenty of in Connecticut, in fact, too much of it. But in terms of really what we need a diversity of types of homes that we just don't have in Connecticut. And that's largely because it's been zoned out of existence. We just have very much adopted this kind of mid-century view of single family house, the backyard, the two cars in the garage. So what that has meant is that plus the fact that Connecticut has not been building housing for 20 years means we are in this current housing crisis where we don't have enough homes for sale. It's about a quarter of the normal average amount of homes for sale in the last 2 years. There's about 3,500 homes for sale in Connecticut, which isn't crazy. And that bleeds into the home rental market too, where people don't have enough rental apartments to choose from. So the cost burden, as others have talked about in these 2 days of the conference, is 40% of households. And then you add in the fact that if 40% of households are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, you're also adding, to Rick's point, 20% of your house income in Connecticut towards transportation costs. So the fact that we have this really one size fits all single family housing, car dependent, low density development means it's putting a significant financial burden, certainly on households, working class folks, communities of color, young people, elderly folks on limited incomes. It's putting a big cost, of course, on us environmentally and fiscally, as we've talked about. So from our perspective, we're really trying to think differently about where we are building homes and think about a more diverse type of home to own or to buy. Think of things like missing middle housing, those duplexes or perfect sixes in Hartford. The housing stock historically that's been in Connecticut that's still in our communities, but most of that is non-conforming and is illegal to build now. So we think starting around our transit stations is a really smart way to leverage existing infrastructure. To Rick's point, to Denise's point, we think it's a really smart way to take pressure off of our ecology and preserve farmland and forestry. And it also does present the opportunity to build a lot more smaller, diverse types of homes that we know young people need starting in their careers, and seniors want to downsize and get out of that big house on 2 floors. So we're missing that component in our building code and certainly our zoning code, but it's also part of the transportation piece of this as well. That's our big, we talk about it as terms of transit-oriented communities instead of transit-oriented development. The reason we do that, and other states are doing that, is we're not trying to think about it as kind of one-off projects. We are trying to think of it holistically as reorienting an entire community's land use around a transit station. So we're trying to get folks thinking out of the project level and more of the community level. And that hopefully can shift some of our limited thinking about car-centric planning. It's hard for people to get out of that, but that's really where it's all tying in to the diversity of homes that we really need.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You did a good job summarizing and tying it up. So I'll move on to the next topic we want to touch upon. And so this one is something that I think we're seeing come to a head more. It's regional versus local. Markets and systems go beyond municipal boundaries. And I can't think of a better place to start than with Rick. So Rick, how might a regional perspective on the development of housing affect outcomes?
I noticed you skipped past the larger title, which I really wanted to attack. But no. But this is where I have concerns about some of the things the legislature has done in the last couple of years. They seem to have focused in on 169 towns and forcing individual communities into doing things, fair share, individual affordable housing plans, but housing markets and job markets don't operate at the level of our 169 towns. In Connecticut, our towns would be neighborhoods in many other states. And so we have to think about, I think we have to think about this regionally. I think if we don't look at the market for housing, the market for jobs, how they overlap and how they spread across communities within our planning regions. As an example, I mean, there's a little bit of difference between federal housing regions, federal job regions, and state planning regions, but not a lot of difference. A market is a market. And I think we need to be looking at build out scenarios for those markets. We need to be looking at what future job demands will be, what future housing demands will be, and then plan regionally toward those solutions. not to go around and say, you know, town A, you must build 20 units, town B, you must build 30 units, but to figure out, using the infrastructure that's in place and the willingness, frankly, of many of our cities to build more dense housing, to create enough within a market so that we can grow our economy in Connecticut, we can continue to grow jobs and provide good wages for families.
Awesome. All right, and Pete, I'm going to volley it to you next. In what ways can a regional and local perspectives on housing support one another?
Yeah, I mean, goes back to our saying all of the above. And you know, I agree, Rick, with a lot of what you said of, you know, some of our solutions at the state level can be kind of minimizing in some ways. And if anyone caught our session yesterday, we talked about, we think Connecticut, because of climate change and internal displacement in other parts of the country, over the next 20 or 30 years, we think Connecticut is going to grow considerably. We have a hashtag of 5x50 CT. We think, as a thought experiment, aspirationally, Connecticut could be 5 million people in 20 or 30 years, just because of it's going to be a little bit better situated in terms of climate change. It's still very vulnerable, and we still have a lot to do to protect ourselves, as Denise, I'm sure, will add on to that. But the reality is we need to think about it in a much bigger scale than we are. 169 cities and towns absolutely cannot plan individually to have the current housing crisis needs met, the current economic trends and job placement delivered. So we certainly support the creation of the affordable housing plan at the municipal level. From our perspective, we've been doing scorecards at a kind of a county level across the state. Not a lot of communities are scoring high, not unexpectedly. It's not something that a lot of communities have the resources, even if they have the political will, to think bigger about it. But it does speak to the limitations of just the structure in our economy and our politics in Connecticut. We don't have that extra regional layer. But we absolutely agree that there is absolutely more any community can do, but we should be really strategic at the state level of where we put our resources in, and i.e. our tax dollars, into parts of our state where we can grow considerably. And we need to be smart about, even at the individual municipal level, where we do grow, because there is the risk, under a fair share model or any other kind of allotment process, that if the priority is you need to have a certain amount of homes, that could mean they're, a 30-minute drive in the northern part of the town, farther away from jobs, farther away from schools and services. That's just perpetuating a lot of the sprawl that we have out here. So it would be a catastrophic mistake to think about it that way and not think about it more around infrastructure, regional nodes, and that type of work. And I know the state fits and starts, and a lot we're pushing, certainly with Work, Live, Ride, our proposal, where they are heading in that direction to think about it that way. And to plan for that a lot more actively. And that's obviously the kind of work that we're doing at the state level. But I'll just close by saying I've been, obviously, a lot of the news you hear is folks rejecting applications and towns shutting down and being anti-homes. And that's true in a lot of places. But what we've pleasantly been finding is there really is an interest and acknowledgement that we have to grow. We have to build more affordable homes, and towns that are really eager to do so, but they need more support from the state. And that's really where I think our intervention with Work, Live, Ride matters, because there are a lot of communities, to Rick's point, that do want to do this. There are a lot of them that are pretty smart about where they want to do it in their communities, but really need to put all those resources together to think proactively, to do it responsibly, to undo a lot of the mistakes and the injustices we've created in this sprawl environment in the 20th century.
Again, you button things up so nicely. You make it very easy for me to transition into the next discussion. You wonderful. So with that, Denise, can you talk about kind of along this same conversation about scale? What scale should environmental assets be viewed from in order to achieve balanced development, and ways in which you can connect to Pete and Rick's ideas? It'd be great, but I know that you've got some really illustrative examples for us on this question as well. You're muted. It wouldn't be a conference unless that happened, right?
I
That's
know,
how
really,
it goes.
at least once, and it was going to
Yeah.
happen to me. So, I think from an environmental perspective, we all know the environment doesn't understand political boundaries, so they're just manufactured. So I think, when we're protecting watersheds, air sheds, food sheds, we need to, look across municipal boundaries. That said, municipalities do a pretty good job of recognizing unique assets in their town that are worth protecting. And I think we should respect that. There's a real place for that. So I think, again, that balance between local and regional. But we also need to understand the relationship, not only across these watershed boundaries, for example, but the relationship between our rural communities and our urban communities, and start planning from that perspective. For example, we need to be thinking about watersheds in our public drinking water supply. And a lot of times, we do have municipalities that are really protective. They understand what's going on and they're really protective of public drinking water supply. But there are some who just turn on the faucet and really don't understand where the water supply comes from. And I'm just going to give you a tale of two cities in Hartford County, where I worked for a while. And it's the tale of Heartland, population 2,000 people or so, and the city of Hartford, population 120,000. Well, if we start talking, as Rick had mentioned, about your fair share, well, what's the fair share? We might get a few more houses out of the town of Heartland. But really, let's look at the relationship between Hartford and Heartland, because Heartland is where the public drinking water supply, over half of the town, is in the watershed to the Barkhamsted Reservoir. So maybe Heartland's fair share is protecting the public drinking water supply for the city of Hartford. And that's not to say that they don't need some affordable housing. Every community needs affordable housing for the seniors, for the workers who need to work in the town. But I think we need to be thinking, more holistically about what the role of. So, and a similar thing is, where are our food sheds? Who's providing all of the food and making sure that we have local food? And if we learned nothing from the pandemic, we realized that having a national food supply system that was broken, and that we really should be gearing up to having local food. So I think we need to be thinking about it in those contexts and looking at, like, what do these communities provide, and not saying it, and how housing is one piece of that. And again, it may be housing in a farm community. That we need to have housing for farm workers or young farmers who want to get into the business. So how do we do that? What's the workforce? What's the need in individual communities? But if we just say, look at it from a fair share, it may be, again, that we need to think about beyond just the number of units, but the fair share in terms of having a resilient and sustainable Connecticut, and what is the role. One of the things I think is detrimental, but I'm seeing a change in this, is that we need to stop talking about rural versus urban. We need to be saying it's one state. How do we work together? And what does everybody provide to the collective good within our state? And that's the important discussion we need to have.
And Denise, I think you do a good job of getting us into our final question before we enter into the Q&A, which I think you all touched upon a bit. So it's just another opportunity to kind of flesh this out a bit. But the tensions explored today are not new concepts. As a younger professional, I know that when I talked to Rick about this, he was like, it's TOD, but it was smart growth. It gets new names all the time. And so I know that there are many in the room who have seen this play out in multiple legislative settings and seasons and years. So our panelists they're aware of that. So do you think that there are specific current policies that have reignited this discussion? If so, what are they, and how do you think it's building out the conversation? And anyone can go first out of the panelists. We've left this one round robin.
I would jump in. I mean, we've already raised the issues of fair share and affordable housing plans for towns. I think one of the positives has been And this started under Governor Malloy, and Governor Lamont has really taken the ball and run with it, which is the investments we've made in our transportation systems. I think it's probably the most important policy change in Connecticut, probably in 50 years. We were, the Department of Transportation was always known as a highway department. I've been around 30 years. I've been through 8 commissioners. It was very much a highway department. The Office of Rails was a sort of a separate office, and public transportation kind of existed in between. When Governor Rell appointed Jim Redeker originally as bureau chief, and then as the commissioner of transportation, we really made a move to become a transit-oriented state and to start investing money in transit. So we've put money into bus service. We've really put money into rails. It's been a huge investment, and continues to be, and continues to go forward as a large investment. One of the interesting things during COVID in our region, we had the smallest drop off in rail transit of any part of Connecticut, because people really rely on it. And many people in our region, in the Naugatuck Valley region, work in service jobs where they have to go every day. They don't get to work from home, and they have to travel back and forth. So I think that those policy decisions to make those investments, to open up the Hartford line, sometimes it calls for sacrifices. I know the people on the Shoreline East are not pleased with recent decisions, but we have to put those resources where they're best used and best needed, and where we can get people between their homes and their jobs. I think that's been a great policy.
Yeah. Oh, if you want to go, Denise.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think there's 2 main policies that I see driving. Obviously, affordable housing has been on our table for many years, but I see 2 things that are kind of bringing communities together and folks together, and that is environmental justice. I think the movement with environmental justice is helping frame the affordable housing discussion, because at first it was, okay, we just need to build housing. Doesn't matter what kind of housing it was. Did not matter where it was located. We could put them in floodplains. We couldn't make sure they weren't energy efficient as long as we had housing. And I think, there's a demand and an expectation from the environmental justice community that we're going to do housing right. So I think that's a real driver. And then the other driver is climate change. And I think we are seeing more flooding. And I think, how are we going to address these issues? And if we keep going down the road of sprawl and just more and more impervious cover and more roads everywhere, we're not going to address some of those critical things, for example, flooding, but also that water quality perspective. I think all of us have experienced drought and seen how drought is going to impact our state. And so how do we protect the public drinking water supply? How do we make sure that those types of issues are brought together? So I think it's rounding out the discussion, because there definitely was a tension, I think, between what was perceived as the environmental community, or what was perceived as the folks who wanted to preserve open space, and the affordable housing folks. And I don't think people, again, were putting everything together. And now we are. And I think, like I said, the environmental justice community demanding that they have access to open space, demanding that they have trees, and that we're talking about urban forestry, and that we're talking about urban agriculture, but also recognizing the role of more regional agriculture, and protecting the public drinking water supply that may not be in downtown Hartford or downtown Bridgeport. And I'm just going to say it's interesting, because I many years ago was working on the first environmental justice board in the state of Connecticut, and that was in Hartford. And when we started talking about what we needed to do, and we started saying, and I brought up this role of the town of Heartland and their public drinking water supply. And it was like I was speaking Greek. People didn't understand watersheds. Watersheds was a fairly new concept. It's not so much now. Not that everybody has it in their lexicon, but more and more people have this notion that we need to protect watersheds, and I think so. And I think part of that is, again, climate change driving that. And I don't think we can underestimate the pandemic, the impact it had on housing and just on people's lives, but also the impact that we saw with food supply and with some of the other types of issues that we need to look at. And people started thinking like, we really need to, if we're going to be resilient, think about how we were impacted by the pandemic and how much more we're going to be impacted by climate change, which is not going to be gone. It's going to be here. And how do we address those?
Yeah, and I'll just to add on, I agree certainly with everything Rick and Denise have said. I mean, I think, to some degree at a philosophical level, that the tension here is, the old is dying, the new is not yet born. It's an Italian political theorist that came up with that. And I think it's apt here because we know that the 20th century sprawl is a failed system. It's unjust, it's unsustainable, it's fiscally irresponsible. We have a lot of legacy infrastructure around that is not going to vanish overnight, and it's not realistic to think of it that way. But we fundamentally have to break with that pattern to think about something new. And I'm not going to sit here and say work, live, ride is the new thing that's going to radically change everything overnight. But what we are trying to say at Desegregate CT is that we do need this new mindset, this new approach, and we need the capacity at the state level to support the innovation at the local level to embrace these new ideas and bring in these things. And it stops and fits. I mean, everything that has been great about rail infrastructure investments, as Rick talked about, is 100% true. And then, yeah, Shoreline East gets cut, even Peak on Metro North gets cut, or fares go up. Or we put state money into our stations and our rail lines, but don't require communities on those stations to change our zoning. So there's got to be a political will that is happening slowly. Just earlier today, the chairs of the P&D committee at the General Assembly, Senator Rahman and Representative Eleni, both said they want to pass Work, Live, Ride, and they want to pass it because we want to build up state capacity to support local innovation. So things are happening. It's going to be slow and incremental. That's not, the enemy of the good is not the perfect. But that's what we're trying to get to. And we're trying to balance all of those needs, all of those different interests as much as possible with Work, Live, Ride as a concept of building around our transit stations, protecting our, green spaces and open spaces. We're having great conversations with the environmental community, the transportation community, the business community, the housing advocacy community, obviously. So these conversations are happening. Some of these silos are starting to get broken down, and that's a really good sign as well. But we do have a really long way to go. But that the old is dying, the new is not yet born is something I think about a lot in this context, because a lot of people in our political structure are kind of de facto defending sprawl and defending the 20th century methods. And we need new leadership and new ideas. It's out there. Transit-oriented communities, transit-oriented development, smart growth, whatever you want to call it, it's been around. And that's a good thing. Like, Connecticut was a transit-oriented state in the 19th century. Like, we can do it again. It's already there. Let's just be smart about it. So that gives me a lot of encouragement that these tensions can kind of be worked out, but some of these people are going to have to push onto the pasture here, for sure. But there are a lot of people that really get this stuff and are doing some new things that I'm very optimistic about.
That's a great response. And for our audience, we were worried about our time, but we actually did really well, panelists. So if anyone wants to respond to Pete, we do have a moment for another response before we go to Q&A. If not, we do have a question already. So I want to give you space to respond to Pete's response before we move on.
Yeah, I just want to echo. I mean, I think the tension is there, but again, I do think it's starting to dissipate, and something like the transit-oriented development. But I just want to put it out there that as planners, and I know Rick knows this, and I've been in the planning field for many, many years, the planners have been talking about this. We've been trying to get our communities to adopt, whatever you call it, low impact development. It is now, in our state stormwater management manual. that you have to do low impact development. So how does that fit into this picture? We've talked about cluster zoning, and almost every town has either cluster zoning or open space zoning or whatever, where we cluster houses on one side of a property and we develop another side. So we've been talking about these tools. We have them in our toolbox. It's a matter of how do we get them, how do we utilize them? How do we make them so that they're more acceptable? And I think the discussion that we've been having, and one of the terms, this anti-sprawl, getting back, because whether you're on the environmental side, whether you're on the affordable housing side, sprawl doesn't benefit anyone. I mean, flight from the city doesn't help. So you don't want, that. You want to invest in our cities. We want them to be vibrant. So how do we go there, right? And make sure that we're putting in models that work. And the last thing I just want to say is that we need to change some of our land use regulations, but we also need to make sure that we have strong land use regulations, because they do protect us, including the environmental justice community. So we need to just do zoning right. We need to make sure we're doing land use, because it is the balance, because otherwise sprawl will continue to happen. So how do we a lot of times people say zoning's the problem. Well, it's like, oh, maybe it's just a matter of like, how do we do zoning right? And then the other piece of that is some new economic models, because one of the things, if we only rely on zoning, is we're relying on the market, right? So we're relying on supply and demand, and we're relying on private developers to solve our affordable housing. And I proposed to folks, and one of the presentations earlier today from Hope in southeastern Connecticut, or I should say southern Connecticut, talked about this, is that there are some other economic models we really need to look at, and we may need to change some of these other tools to help them. But if we only rely on the market, and with a strong economy like we have in Connecticut, we're not going to meet our affordable housing goals. We need to be looking at other economic models for this.
Absolutely. SM, were you going into questions?
I can. And as we head to that, I just want to thank you all again for your perspectives, and hone in on the fact that even though we're coming at housing from different lenses, everyone that spoke today wants to see more housing. To Denise's point, and to everyone's point, they want to see it done right. And so I'm someone who learns from hearing other perspectives, and I find that I'm most effective where I can hear what Denise is saying, and when I hear it again when I'm talking to a commissioner or a community member, I'll be better equipped to validate where an environmental concern may lie, or a transportation concern may lie, or a housing concern may lie. And so best solutions can acknowledge where people are coming from, and that's really what we were hoping to do today, is have this conversation, not at a contentious P&Z meeting, not in a legislative hearing. We wanted to kind of give you different perspectives. So thank you to everyone who came. And we've got one question from Sarah currently, but feel free to add questions to the chat, or I'm not sure if I can see hands, but you can also raise your hands and speak that way. But Sarah Locke said, what tools or strategies have any of the panelists found to be successful or effective in harnessing the energy of conflict over competing interests for positive results for a town or a region?
I'll jump in on this one. I think the tool, we have to start thinking at different scale. And one of the tools that everyone has and very few use well are the Council of Governments. I have to tell you, I'm very blessed. I have a Council of Governments who have really good CEOs who sit around the table and discuss issues that affect all of them and affect them individually as well. And, so we always have these debates. There's not us in particular, but there have always been these debates about building affordable housing in suburban communities versus building affordable housing in more urban communities, and what's discriminatory, what's not. And I have to tell you that forum of CEOs around the table who realize that they share a part of the state has been the greatest tool for us to make progress on discussions about where investments should be made and how regions carry their fair share. The biggest, you talk about competing interests. The biggest competing interest, again, is the local property tax. It's hard to get anyone to agree to cooperate. If we could bring in a company that's going to create 500 jobs that pay $100,000 a year, if that building, the physical footprint of that building is going to be on this side of the town property line, you have a very little chance of getting the CEOs outside of that town line to support that project. They want the revenue. They want to compete for that business. And if they don't physically locate that business in their town, that town doesn't derive any income from it, even though their residents will derive salaries from it. And everyone will grow. It's having those kinds of conversations around the table and throwing support behind projects that you might not get the property tax from, but it's residents who have to be able to support this. Chief elected officials can't do this. They can't take these approaches if residents are going to say, well, what do you mean we're supporting and spending money to bring this business into that town so they get all the money? So I think conversations like that are important. I think they've been really helpful in solving problems and getting our region to work together to bring in different businesses, to support different types of housing development, and to create jobs for people that are real.
Yeah, if I could just add in, I think the idea of getting communities to work on the regional level, whether it be and look at things like watersheds and whatever, I think it's really important. The one tool I think that I heard this from the state senator Moore from Bridgeport. She has indicated that she really thinks we need to be working with all municipalities and get all of them engaged. And I think that's really important. One of our challenges is that we have over 100 communities, 100 municipalities in Connecticut that have a population of less than 20,000 people. So how do we make sure that we're working with those really small communities that don't have transit hubs? It's a large voice in Hartford. So how do we overcome that? And I think the willingness of our legislators, particularly that represent communities like Bridgeport and Hartford, to say, we need to hear from everyone, and we understand it's not one size fits all. So I think bringing people to the table and saying, how do we do this? And that's what I hope they'll do with fair share. That fair share won't be just some formula where they, figure out like you have to do 2 units and you have to do 20 units, but they really look at what does it make from a region? What do you contribute and what do you do from a region so that we can have these discussions? What kind of housing do you need in your community? Because even if you're the smallest community or the largest community, you still need housing for seniors, for your kids coming back from college, for single moms. We need housing for all of those folks in every community. And how do we do this? And the last thing I'd like to say that I don't think we've tapped into enough in Connecticut, and the reason I mentioned these 100+ communities is at a population of less than 20,000, they're considered rural communities and actually can apply for rural development, where we heard a lot of information today about HUD and other federal programs, but we didn't hear anything about the support for housing from rural development, even though it impacts 100 of our communities. So I think we need to be thinking about that and how we look at all of the federal resources that are coming in and making sure that these 100+ communities that are the smaller communities have access. If we really want them engaged, what's the access that they need, and the funds that they can get where they might not qualify for the big HUD grants or the community block grants, but they might be able to get the rural development grants. And we need to be starting to talk about that with them as well.
I'm going to Pete, I don't want to cut you off, but we have a
Oh,
question.
that's fine.
So let's let Ashley ask, and then Pete, if you can answer, let's put you on it first.
Good deal. Thank you. I first want to say, and I'm just going to put it out there, Denise, if you are looking for a mentee, I know you say you're retired, please reach out. I think what you were saying is spot on in terms of what happened during especially the height of the pandemic, where folks who were working in housing justice really noticed and really became aware of the component of environmental justice and how it is important in our work. And especially when we talk about housing, affordable housing, more housing, right? Especially in a state like Connecticut, where we love our hiking trails, right? Where we love to be one with nature and also as part of our work to be aware of the environment. So want to put myself out there with that. And also, as I think more about the connection between the two, curious about the education access when it comes to our community members and understanding the connections between transit and biodiversity, right? And understanding housing and environmental justice, and curious on the panel's thoughts on education to our community members to further understand how that affects their everyday and their housing choices.
I actually appreciate you asking that, Ashley, because that was my policy tool strategy. It is education, it is organizing, which is a lot of the work that we try to do, particularly at the local level, because these things are kind of complicated, and a lot of people don't know the history of redlining or urban renewal or exclusionary zoning, Fair Housing Act. They don't understand that the world we live in Connecticut specifically is not organic. 67% of residents of color living in less than 15 municipalities out of 169 is not organic. And we have to really understand that baseline of how that happens, why everything's so low density, car centric, single use, to really get people to think not just what is a deficit that we have right now, which I do think we can fall into a lot in the housing community, talk about what we don't have, but actually to think about something different and new. So the education piece for us is obviously our zoning atlas and putting all these different dots together, speaking to different community members, listening to different community members and different types of groups to kind of try to get everybody to be on the same page of here's why this housing crisis exists and this climate crisis is making everything worse. But we do really want to try to educate folks and empower folks to think positively about it's not doom and gloom. We can do something really transformative in our state. It's very likely Connecticut is going to be much, much bigger and a center for climate migration in a way that was not the case in the 20th century. And just to think about that as a positive puts a lot of urgency now to think about how we solve these issues and how we build up the state capacity, build up all of our personal imaginations to think about a much, much different landscape that we can live into. So it all starts with education and organizing. And we just have a basic premise at Desegregate Connecticut that despite all the headlines and some of the people that show up at P&Z meetings, people want this stuff. People are afraid of their communities stagnating, kids not being able to afford to move back, seniors not being able to stay in community and stay in town. They're worried about climate change. But there are solutions out there, and Connecticut is so uniquely positioned to take advantage of its infrastructure that's been here for 200 years and can still absorb a lot of growth that can fundamentally change that inequality spectrum that we have in this state. So organizing for that, organizing for a better future is the baseline. I'm not talking about doing this stuff in 30 years. I'm talking about doing it next session and starting that process. And there are plenty of people out there thinking the same way and trying to have those conversations.
And I think your organization's doing it. I think Partnership for Strong Communities with their iForums and their events that they're talking about in the next year. That's another place to learn, Ashley. Rick touched upon it. COGS. We just did a very intensive land use training where we had state partners. That's online. And we prioritized inviting community members. I see that Lillian McKenzie's here from Team Inc. They have their all-in chapters. The infrastructure's there. And so we hope that you could connect with us. I shared Denise's email, so please reach out to her via that. But if anyone wants to hear about any of the programs that we all run or we know about, please do reach out. And then there's Pete's email, so I'll hand it over to Chelsea. But thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, attendees, for a wonderful session today.
It really was an amazing session. I always get bummed because it's the sessions at the end of the day where people tucker out, and there are so many more people that I think would have really benefited from hearing this session. But I will say that everyone watches them, right? So that I feel like is the promise. But what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. And this is the last session of the conference. So I don't have anything to pitch for you to go to next other than, SN did the work for me, is keep in touch with everyone that you met here. I know it's hard via Zoom. There's a wonky tab of people in the Zoom lobby platform. Go meet people that you saw on a little screen, set up time to talk to them in real life, make connections that you either have not made, or reconnect with people that you haven't talked to in a while. I feel always so energized by this conference because the answers are here, the power is here, the people are here. We have most of the tools. It's figuring out how to align them. So thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for an amazing session. And thank you to all of you for attending this year's conference. I hope to see some of you at the in-person reception, which I'm going to jet off to now at the Lyceum in Hartford. And we'll see you again at the next conference, but I'm sure sooner. Thank you so much, everyone.